Shalom, y'all, and good morning. Luke 15 starts with Jesus being attacked by the Pharisees because Jesus has been eating with sinners and tax collectors. And eating in the first century is a very intimate sort of thing you do normally only with your own family. And the Pharisees are upset because Jesus is accepting sinners into fellowship with him. Jesus answers this attack with three parables, three stories: the story of the lost sheep, the story of the lost coin, and the story of the lost sons. But there's a lot more going on here than just something being lost. Debbie today takes a look at this parable and looking at it in its original social context, which brings out all kinds of nuances that we've never ever thought about before. I feel sure there'll be several things in here that will surprise you about the parable. And she makes a great point that what this parable is really doing and what Jesus is really asking is, what is the condition of your heart? So let's join Debbie as she looks at Luke 15 and find out what the condition of our heart really is.
We're going to be looking at Luke 15, which is the prodigal son story. And I learned so much this week. I ended up looking at some things that John MacArthur had prepared on this chapter. And I'm really excited about a lot of the little things that I didn't know that he had in the work that he had done. So I think when we tend to look at this story, we can try and do some identification with different perspectives in the story. And so that's what kind of the direction I want us to go. I want us to look at the three hearts and the idea of who we're identifying with. I don't know if y'all tend to do this, but on sometimes on Facebook, they'll have those little games where it's like, oh, answer these questions and see which character you're closest to, or which animal type you are. And there's the Disney one, which Disney princess are you, or Disney character are you? And so I do those periodically, but there are a couple of people in our department at work who do those kinds of things regularly. And last year they got an idea, and it always scares me when there are two people in particular, when they get an idea, it's you never know where you're going to end up. And so Katie and Kinsey had the idea that for our yearbook photos, the English department should all dress up as Disney characters, and we had to be ones that were reflecting our identity, who we are, and as people. And so, there's one little girl who teaches with us. Everybody, chimed in immediately. Oh, Angela, you are Snow White. I mean, if the birds were singing and talking and doing all the, the cleaning, yeah, that's who she is. She would be surrounded by that. And there's another little girl, Amber, who, she's Alice in Wonderland. She looks like her exactly. And then they turned to me. And John, I'm going to get you to go ahead and show that picture. There I am. That's who they said I was, Mary Poppins. So this is how I appeared in last year's yearbook at River Bluff High School. And evidently it was scarring enough that I had to change the color of my hair so they won't recognize me again. But okay, John, you can take it down. It's uncomfortable. Thank you.
I was going to say it was stuck like that, but
but usually in a situation like that, you've got a lot of choices in terms of who your character matches. And I don't know how well I match Mary Poppins, but that's what they said. But today's text only gives us three choices. And what Jesus is doing in this story is really challenging his audience to see what kind of heart they have. Which character's heart do they match? So if we look at the background again, remember that Jesus had been teaching in Galilee. He's previously, before he gets to this parable, has told the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. And then he goes directly into this one that we call the prodigal son. And we know that they're the three characters in the story. And we've got the younger son and the older son, and then the father. And of course, a parable is representative. So for the audience of the time, we know that the younger son was representative of those who didn't keep the law, and that could be Gentiles or the unobservant Jews, lower class Jews, but those who were out of step with the guidelines for Judaism that God had set, but also that the Pharisees kind of added to. And then we've got the older son, who is representative of the Pharisees and the scribes in Jesus' audience. And then we've got the father, who is God the Father. So we're going to start and read verses 11 and 12 really quickly to get some context about this father and these two sons. So Jesus continued, and he's continuing from the other parables to this one. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he, the father, divided his property between them. Now, one thing that I wasn't aware of that I learned in the studying this week was the Jewish law for inheritance. And this information actually came from something that Bob Diefenbaugh had written, and I'd found in a couple of other places. But there were two ways that you could give your property to your heirs. The first was through a last will and testament. And in this case, if you had a last will and testament, then the father was always going to be bound by the provisions of the law. And the law said that the firstborn son received 2/3 of the whole in this case, okay? So he always gets twice, a bigger portion, all right, twice as much. And that, if you look at Deuteronomy, it explains that. So the law is very clear that the older son is supposed to get the bulk of the estate if you go through a last will and testament. But there was another option for giving gifts before the father died. And that was a way that gave them a little more freedom in terms of what they could do with their property. So if a father decided to make gifts, then normally what would happen is he would give the property, the capital, but keep the income. All right. So if you had a farm, all right, if you had 3 farms, you could give this child this farm, but you're still keeping control of the farm and you're still getting the income from that farm. So he never relinquished his position of honor while he was still alive, because he still had control of the farm. He wouldn't say, "This is yours, take it over now, take it and go." It was just kind of I want you to start to learn how to manage this. And there was accountability that was a part of that process of gifting before a last will and testament. So he still had access to everything that was earned as the child managed the property. Okay. So we've got those two systems. Now, the big deal with this verse in verse 12 is to even ask for the inheritance or for the gift was a sign of massive disrespect. In essence, what this son is saying to his father by "give me my part of the estate" is he's saying, "You're as good as dead, and I kind of wish you were." So as important as the father figure is in Middle Eastern culture and in Jewish culture and in Jewish law, that would have been a huge affront for this young man to say this to his father, because it violates that commandment. It says, honor your father and your mother. And he is not honoring his father by making that request. Now, the other thing that I found out was looking at the word that the young man uses to talk about his inheritance or the estate, okay? Because it says, give me my share of the estate. And the word that's used there is actually Greek, and I do not speak Greek, but it's tes, ousias, I don't know, ousias. And it means literally the material goods. All right, so give me the material goods. It's the only place that this is used in the New Testament. And, Greek wasn't used in the Old Testament. So it's the only place that it's used in the Bible. And normally the word that's used when we're talking about inheritance is kleronomia. And that word has additional weight to it. So if you use the word inheritance, kleronomia, then you're talking not only about the goods, you're talking about the accountability, the responsibility. And so when we looked at the law and what the law said and what the rules about giving gifts intended, then that word kleronomia goes along with the gifting before the father died, where there is accountability. He still has a responsibility to the father and he answers to the father. But remember, that's not the word that the kid used. He uses, give me the stuff. I want the material goods. And so by using that word, he's saying, all I want is that. I don't want the accountability. I don't want the responsibility. I don't want the leadership. I don't want anything in terms of what's going to be a responsibility to this family, even. I don't want to have to care for anyone. I just want the stuff. So again, the son isn't asking what he'll get. He just says that he wants it. And we see that the father gives the insolent son what he asked for, which to me is so puzzling. I mean, I have to imagine that this kid has made some poor choices before. And that when the father gives this, he gives it knowing this young man and what's probably going to happen to his inheritance. But he does it anyway because he has given this son free will. Now think about it, because that issue of free will, there have been a number of times where God has given the nation of Israel what they asked for, like with the king. I mean, we know that up until they kept saying, we want a king, we want a king, we want a king, that God had led the nation of Israel through the judges, through the prophets. And it's a situation where he says, okay, I'm going to give you what you asked for. And God, omnipotent God, omniscient God, sees what's coming. He knows what's coming as a result of this. But because he's made us creatures that have free will, then sometimes he turns us over to what we ask for. And that's what we see with this young man. All right, so there's our context. And it creates some conflict, obviously, among the three characters because of the brazen request of this young man. So we're going to take a look at verses 13 through 21, and we're going to concentrate on heart number one. And heart number one is the heart of that young man who made that request. And obviously, the request itself reveals something about it. So we pick up after he's made this very rude request, and see where he takes us. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.'" Okay, so here's the prodigal coming home. And I started looking at that word prodigal. I didn't know where it came from, but it's an old English word that means spendthrift. Okay, so it's not just the wanderer, it's literally somebody who is wasteful, who is self-indulgent in a very senseless way. And that certainly describes this young man. And so that's how we know him, by the name of this story, the prodigal son. But that word prodigal never once appears in the story, which is interesting because that's how we know it. But is it really the story of that son? No. And so it just describes his heart. And it's not given a name. We've assigned it that. And I think there's a reason why, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So if you look at the events in this passage, we know that we had the young man make the request, and that was a sign of insolence. And then he goes far away, all right? Which means, y'all, he's in a Gentile land, which again, the horror. So not only has he shamed his father by making this request, he has gone to live among the heathen. And so there he goes. And when he gets there, there's the famine. Now, I have found a description of a famine from the 1800s, and it didn't say exactly where it occurred, but it was in the Middle East somewhere. But this was a historical text. So it was an account from that time. And this was the description: children being sold into slavery to keep them from starving, people found dead every morning on the streets, straying animals were killed and eaten raw before someone else could steal the meat. Shoe leather, rotten flesh, and garbage were all devoured. People ate palm trees. Families in the village, seeing death on them, closed up the doors of their houses and awaited death in a room to keep their own bodies from being devoured by hyenas. Entire villages were wiped out. So it's not just, I've got a little bit of hangry going on. This is utter devastation that's occurring in this place where this young man is. And so he finds himself in need. Now, this is not a young man who's accustomed to being in need. So in his world, he might have thought he had hit rock bottom, because what he has to do, he has to get a job. And he's still not willing to go home. Notice that. So has he really hit rock bottom? Question mark. So plan A for him is get a job. And so he does get a job tending pigs. So again, here is another shame, because remember, in Jewish culture, where does the pig fall? Unclean, unclean. And so he is feeding pigs, tending pigs as his job. And real rock bottom then comes, because while he's feeding the pigs, he is envying what the pigs get to eat. And he can't even get that. So now, not only has he gotten a job, the job doesn't even give him enough to be able to feed himself. So here is rock bottom. And this is where plan B comes into play. He decides to go home. But he's going to go home not as a son, but as a hired servant. It really shows his humility that he's willing to go in and do this, because in that time period, hired servants, the hired hands, were below the slaves. Okay. And you'll see the mention of the fact that he has father's hired servants have food to spare, but he doesn't talk about slaves. And the father in his account in just a few minutes is going to. So there's a difference between slave and hired hand in the social structure. If you were a slave, you lived in the family and you were taken care of as a part of the family in that Middle Eastern culture. They weren't paid wages necessarily, but they were supported. Okay, so if the family had means, the slaves had means. They were part of the household. They gave you your food, they gave you your lodging, took care of your needs. Maybe you had a little pocket money for some discretionary things, but you were a part of that family unit. The hired hands were not. They basically had no one caring for them. They were ones that were more itinerant. They would come and go. They were out on their own as the lowest of the low. But they received wages. Now, I tend to think of them as some of these workers that you would find if you go in certain places in Colombia even. You can go and you can find some guys who will work for the day. They're just day laborers. I know that there's a place when you're going out on, I can't remember the name of the road. Isn't that terrible? Gervais Street. If you go Gervais Street before it hits Millwood, there's a little store there where you can go and men are standing there really early in the morning. And I didn't know this until I had to do some work at Dreer and was traveling that way at 10 till 7. But there would be a group of men standing there. And I found out that these were guys who were waiting for people to come along and say, okay, I need 2 guys to do some heavy lifting for the day. I'll pay you this. And Jesus actually describes in another story those kinds of workers. If you remember, there was the story about the men who were hired to work in the field. And one was hired at 6, one was hired at 9, one was hired at the 11th hour. And remember, they all got the same rate of pay. And that was part of the point. It didn't matter when you came in, because it was up to the generosity of the employer to pay you. And you weren't in any position to be able to negotiate and barter. You just took what he gave you. And so that's where this young man finds himself. Is he needs something, anything to survive. He said, I can go back and I can work for my father as a hired servant, which was the lowest of the low. You had no standing at all. And at least I know I'll have something to eat. So when we look at the heart of the son, we see 2 different hearts. We see the heart at the beginning that's definitely foolish. I mean, he is greedy, he is self-centered, he's irresponsible, he's rebellious, he is shameless, he is insolent, he's a fool. By the time we get to the end of those verses, then we see a young man whose heart is self-aware. He saw those things in himself. And at this point, he's broken, he's sad, he's alone, he's penitent. But there's one thing his heart also knows. He knows his Father, and he believes in his Father. So we've got that heart. And the next shift in the passage comes with a description of the Father's heart. So I'm going to read that, verses 20 through 24, okay? We already read 20 and 21, but I'm going to read it again. So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. So what characteristics do we see about the heart of the Father in those verses? Well, he definitely has a loving heart for his sons. All right, I'm making it plural. We'll see that in the next couple of verses, but he definitely has a loving heart for his sons. And he gave the son free will. He tried to give him the chance to move into a position where he demonstrated a heart that was worthy of being part of the family. He gave them free will. And he longs for the return of this insolent son. How do we know that? Well, it says he's watching for him. All right. He never forgot this wayward son. He's watching. And then he runs to meet him. Now, this is the most interesting thing I think I found out. Middle Eastern custom, that father, Middle Eastern custom would have dictated that the father who had been shamed would actually refuse to see the son. And we don't see that in this particular story. This father doesn't do that. So the father would refuse to see the son that was returning in disgrace. The village would taunt and scorn this young man who was coming back in disgrace because he was insolent to his father. He shamed his father. He had been spending time in the place. I mean, it was basically one of those, he had been living in sin in Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? All right, everybody there knew. Okay. And so they would have shamed him, spit on him. He would have been just absolutely abused and taunted coming back. So what's the significance of the running? Other than it's this violation of their custom. Well, he sees him when he's a long way off. And it says that the father felt compassion. Now, that word compassion that was used there is this word that's called splanchosomia. It comes from the root that means your intestines or your bowel or your abdomen, a sick feeling. So it's not just, "Oh, I feel sorry for you." It's a sick feeling because that father knows what that son is going to face coming into that village. Remember, he sees him a far way off. And so he ran to meet the son before he faces the scorn. Now, running, Middle Eastern noblemen do not run. They do not run. It's shows a lack of dignity. And one of the main reasons they actually couldn't in the robes that they were wearing. I mean, think about it. Men and women are wearing these robes. So in order to run, you've got to gather up your robes and you've got to hold them or wrap them up, tuck them up, and you show your legs. I mean, and it is shameful for him to show his legs. Kind of like in Victorian period, you know, they put skirts around everything. You didn't have around a piano, you had, or around a table, you had skirts because you didn't show the legs, and you certainly didn't show your own legs. But same thing here. You don't show your legs. That would be shameful for him to show and expose his legs. Now, there was such an objection to the idea of running. This was what just blew my mind, that in some versions of the Bible that are done in Arabic, they don't use the word run, and they won't use the word run. They just say hurried, because it was such a cultural no-no that they didn't even put that in there. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's huge. That's huge. And I'd never read that before. And that's part of what I found in that John MacArthur part. And I thought, oh, this is like mind blowing, because this father shames his son himself in order to run and help divert the shame that was coming toward that son who had been so insolent to him. Why is he running? To take on the shame of the son. What does that sound like? What has God done for us? He willingly took on the shame of the rebellious son. God takes on willingly the shame of the rebellion of our sin. Anyway, this blew my mind. And he grants forgiveness willingly and celebrates the fact that this dirty, ragged son has come back. Now, think about who's hearing this. In the eyes of the Pharisees, every single thing that the father did was wrong. Everything the father did was wrong. And everything that the father did in terms of dealing with that disgraceful and shameful son was disgraceful and shameful. So the eyes of the Pharisees see it that way, but more importantly, the hearts of the Pharisees see it that way. And that's where we get to heart number 3, and that's the heart of the older son. 25 through 31. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. All right, so what do we need to notice about the older son? Well, Junior, I'm going to call him Junior because as older son, you know, normally they get the father's name. So Junior's been out in the field laboring. Now, that wouldn't have been the custom of the time because remember, he's the oldest son. He's got the position of honor, and this is a wealthy family. He should have been in working with dad. But what has he done? He's separated himself from dad. He's distanced himself from dad in not too different a way than the younger son did. Remember, the younger son wanted away. So did the older son. Nobody calls Junior to the party. Did you notice that, you know, the father didn't call him out there and bring him in? Because if the son had been where he was supposed to be, he would have known about the party. And was he even interested in celebrating the fact that his brother came home? Obviously not. Okay. He even pouts when he has the opportunity to go in and join the party. Now, going in and joining the party isn't just a celebration of the son, it's an honoring of the father, because he's seen the way this father has been mourning the loss of the son. But he doesn't do it. It's a sign of rebellion that he's standing outside. So he's rebellious, just like this other son is rebellious. But it's an inner rebellion, which a lot of times is more dangerous than that outer rebellion. And he blames the father. Look at this verse 30. But when this son of yours. I mean, think about it. We hear, I don't have children, but I've heard fights, and that is your son who did that. They never said it about the daughter. Okay. Anyway, but it's like, I'm not taking responsibility. This son of yours, this family member that doesn't really belong in our family. And y'all, the older brother is obviously resentful. So we have an older brother who resented at the fact that the younger brother who had repented. So what does it say about his heart? Overall, he is self-righteous. He's proud. He's materialistic because he's interested in the things, isn't he? He's greedy. He is self-centered. He's rebellious. He's jealous. He sounds just like his brother, doesn't he? What do we see about the father's heart here? We have a continuation of a revealing of heart number 2, the father. He seeks out this son too. Remember, he goes outside. He wants to restore fellowship. And we see that this father is a promise keeper, because in 31, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. He's going to keep the promise to give the son exactly what the law says he's supposed to get. And he's equally gracious to both sons. Again, the Pharisees are going to be stunned by the father's reaction to the older son, because remember, the older son is their guy. He's done the right thing. He should be recognized for the work that he's doing, for being good. But good and work and good works don't equal salvation. It's the repentant heart that makes the difference. So to end, where are our hearts? Do we look like the immoral, irreligious sinner, the younger son, which I'd say by the fact that a lot of us, we are on Sunday morning in Sunday school, we may not look like that. Or do we look like the moral religious sinner? Because there are two sinners in that story. There are two prodigals in that story. It's not the prodigal son, it is the prodigal sons. Remember, y'all, he chose not to go into the banquet. He chose. There's free will. He chose not to go into the celebration, the reward. His heart kept him out because his heart wasn't repentant. And what we as believers really should have as our goal is to have a heart that's been transformed to look like that father's heart. That's where our heart needs to be, that celebrates the reunion, that realizes that the whole idea is being together. And y'all, that party wasn't to honor the son. The party is to honor the merciful heart of the father. And that's what our reward is all about. When you look at what we have in terms of getting our reward, what are we going to do with the crowns? Lay them at the feet of Jesus. It's all about the fact that that father was willing to run and take on the shame to remove it from the son. And he was willing to do it again for the older son. He walks out of the party just like God walked out of heaven to get that son. So where's our heart? Like I said, there were some things in studying this week that just blew my mind. So I've got some heart examining. I wish this had been Valentine's Day, but I've got some heart examining to do because I don't want to be like that older brother. So we're going to close with prayer. And Dave Elledge, would you be willing to pray for us if John opens your mic? Or if you unmute yourself?
Dave will have to unmute himself.
Unmute yourself, Dave, and if you don't mind praying for us.
There we go. Y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this wonderful lesson. Thank you for Debbie bringing us the word today, Father. Thank you for this merciful heart that you have, Father, that you love us. And Father, I just pray that you would be with us in this coming week. Keep us safe, Father. Those that are getting vaccines, Father, I pray that you would just keep them safe to move on forward with that. Father, bring us back next week. Thank you again for Debbie, John, and Joel as they week in and week out bring us a message. Be with Wes as he brings us a message today. And Father, just again, we thank you for all that you do for us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.